Hello and welcome to another installment of What's New in Prisma. I am Ryan. I'm a developer advocate here at Prisma, and with me today is Daniel Norman. Daniel is here in place of who you might regularly expect to see. Nico is who you might expect to see beside me, but today we have Daniel. Daniel, thank you for joining me as Nico is on vacation. How are you doing?
Pretty well. It's nice to be here. So I think the last time I joined this live stream was the Christmas edition, and
Mhm.
it's amazing to notice how quickly time flies, hey?
That's true. Yeah, like 4 months on now. It seems like just yesterday. The year is chugging along, and lots of cool stuff, of course, has been coming through for Prisma in terms of development. We've got another release to talk about today, 2.21, and there are some cool new features that we'll go through. So that's the plan today. We're going to talk about some of the new stuff that you can see at 2.21. Daniel's got a demo to do. We've got some other things to talk about, but relatively quick stream today. I think we'll see how it goes, though. We do welcome any kind of questions that you may have that we'll be happy to answer as we go along. But before we get onto the show, Daniel, what have you been up to in terms of your work at Prisma? Any kind of cool things you've been working on?
Yeah, I've actually been delving into the whole world of monitoring applications and really there's a lot of different terms for this kind of thing, but monitoring, APM, application performance monitoring, and open tracing and open telemetry. So really trying to sort of create some content around how to actually see what's going on in the internals of your application, how to debug effectively when things go wrong, that kind of thing.
Cool. Excellent. Yeah. And you and I have collaborated a little bit on that sort of topic where we're working on some content for our data guide, which will help people to reason about what might be happening if their database goes down, if they find themselves up in the middle of the night and their database is not, they're not able to connect to their database. We've got some advice that we are drafting up into an article for folks in that regard. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, I've been working alongside you on that topic. I've also been working on some customer stories, which will highlight some of our users, some of our Prisma users, companies that have found success with Prisma, and telling the story of how they went about it. So that's what I've been up to. And I think, we're going to be marching on towards more content as we go towards, talking about this whole release of Prisma as a complete product later this month. Before we get there, though, we should talk about the latest release, 2.21. And why don't I show the release notes here? So here's what I will do. I'll pop this over here.
Yeah, you mentioned actually customer stories, and today I saw Calend, an open source Calendly alternative. I think it reached like #2 on Hacker News.
Okay.
So maybe we can check that out later.
Cool.
But that was built using Prisma 2.
Oh, excellent. Very cool. I just started using an alternative to Calendly, which is SavvyCal. Have you seen SavvyCal?
No, I haven't.
SavvyCal is really cool. It's definitely, I think, a step above Calendly just in terms of the user experience, the features that it has, and it's small but growing, and I've been happy with it so far. So I am excited to check out this new one that you've just mentioned. That is really cool. As we do that, let's take a look at the release notes here. So 2.21, here's the release notes. If you go to our GitHub Prisma and you go to releases and you look for the tag 2.21, you will find it. And what's new at 2.21? We've got a couple features, a couple changes, things that are deprecated, which we'll talk about just now. So this first one is probably the most exciting one of the bunch. And this is the ability to order by an aggregate in group by. And so that's a bit of a mouthful. What does it look like? I think this will give you a sense of what this feature accomplishes. A little while back, we introduced group by. You can choose to group by a specific field, like city in this case. And you can also get the count for city, the count of, an aggregation there. Now you can order by the count of that city in this case, and you can do it in a descending fashion or an ascending fashion. So this goes a little deep, but you can now order by the you can order by an aggregate in group by. Daniel's going to show this in a demo to make it a little bit more clear, but this is really cool because now we're starting to see all these things things come together, where you can do group bys, you can order by aggregates, and now you can aggregate by group by altogether. So very cool feature. Daniel will take a look at that in just a little bit. If you want to take a look at the documentation, the link is here. Order by aggregate group is what you'll be looking for there. Anything you want to say on that right now, Daniel, or should we just wait until you do your
Yeah, I think we can wait and we'll get into it in the demo.
Okay, perfect. Breaking changes to be aware of. Aggregates are now nullable. So this is an interesting case where previously what would happen is if you try to aggregate on something, let's say you were trying to do a sum on amount is what we see in this little example, and you didn't have any records for your posts, for example, or if some of those records were null. What you would find is if you were expecting perhaps null to be the result because you had no records, instead you'd be getting 0 out. So you would say sum amount will be 0. Now, in some cases, this might be technically correct. Like if you don't have any posts to aggregate on, technically the amount would be 0. But this is a little bit unexpected and may cause bugs in your application. Things that you might not expect to happen could be coming through if we return 0 instead of null. So now what happens is if you are aggregating on something that isn't there, if you don't actually have any records, you're going to get null out for that aggregation. So that kind of, I think, is more in line with what people might expect to happen here. And it also is beneficial for your application so that you don't introduce these subtle bugs based on nulls and zeros and falsy values and that sort of thing. So take a look for that. I don't think there's a whole lot to do if you are happy. Well, you'll probably want to take a look through the release notes. Make sure there's nothing you need to change in your code. It's likely that you can just let it sit, but if you want to be extra sure, just take a look through where you are doing this, and if perhaps you need to apply a test or something to make sure your values are coming through as you expect. What else to talk about? Disconnect no longer throws an error on unconnected records. This is not something that I personally came across myself, but I guess there was this error that used to be thrown if you were trying to disconnect on a record and that connection didn't exist. So there was feedback saying that it was unnecessary to do this. People had to write boilerplate around it. And so now what happens is this error just will not be thrown. You will just be passed right through in this I guess transaction, or not transaction, but in this operation. Disconnect will go through if it exists, but if it does not exist, it will just pass through without much fuss. So this one, unlikely to affect you, but do check out the release notes. Make sure that you are covered in this case, and just make sure that there's nothing that's going to break your logic in your application. What else to talk about? DB generated. This was a function to define default values. I guess this is no longer permitted. Daniel, I don't know a whole lot about this one, but is there anything you want to say on DB generated? Have you come across this or used it yourself?
Yeah, so the title might be slightly misleading, but the case for DB generated is basically when you want to use one of the functions that your database might provide. And a good example of this is, say, UUID. So in Postgres, you can generate on the Postgres level a UUID, and you can sort of pass that into this DB generated. And what it will do is when it creates the SQL migration file, it'll actually take whatever is in the quotes. So you can still use default DB generated, but you can't just have 2 empty quotes. If you want to have a default like empty string, you actually need, and this is sort of exemplified in the example there, that you need to add the actual additional quotes within the double quotes of DB generated. But the idea there is that it can't just be an empty string. You can still use DB generated, and if you want it to be an empty string as the default, then you can just add these special quotes within the single quotes. Or alternative, you can sort of still call a database function like the UUID function that is provided by Postgres.
Gotcha. Yep. So it is not that DB generated itself is no longer permitted. It's that the double quotes would be the issue there. So if you are using it in this fashion, do check out the breaking changes there and make sure that you adjust. Thank you, Daniel. Fixes and improvements, a bunch to list here. We'll let you take a look through the release notes to have a look at what's happening here in terms of fixes. And then what else can we talk about? We've shipped some stuff for Prisma Studio. Switch theme based on OS preferences. This is an interesting one because Ryan Florence from the Remix team, people might know Ryan Florence, who works on Remix along with Michael Jackson. He was doing a live stream the other day, last week, I think it was, where he was at the end of it, he was wondering if Studio would take on the preferences of the OS in terms of whether it should display dark mode or light mode, and he tested it out, and it was not happening. Perhaps that was the impetus for us to ship this, but we have shipped it nonetheless. So Ryan, if you're watching or if you see this, we've got you covered. You can now switch to light or dark mode based on system preferences. Some other stuff that has gone into Studio there, we'll let you check it out. And I think that is just about it. I don't know, Daniel, is there anything in particular you wanted to pull out? I skimmed over a bunch of this stuff because I think it gets pretty deep, but I'll let you say if you want to go over anything else here.
Yeah, so the first item for Prisma Migrate might be an interesting one. Basically, we had this problem that when you would, assuming that you had a compound index that was defined on a model, and in that compound index, it was referencing say, two fields, and you would change the type for one of those fields, one of those columns that you have in your model. What Migrate would do is it would actually drop the column, create a new one, and it wouldn't update the index until the next one. Because basically when you drop the column, it would drop also the index, and the index would only be created on the next migration that you create. And so that was leading to a bit of confusion, but that's been resolved now. And so that's no longer a problem. I think that was reported by one of the users. In fact, it was quite an interesting user. And I think we'll have a really interesting user story from them. Cool. At some point. But yeah, I think that was an interesting one. And besides that, no, I think there were quite a lot of like really deep kind of bugs, small bugs that were fixed. But that's mostly it.
Excellent. Okay, cool. Well, if that's the case, I will get us set up here so that you can share your screen and give us the demo on the aggregate in group by if you want to do that.
Yeah, before we do that, I see there's already some questions coming in. Do we want to look at those?
Why don't you know what? We should do a Q&A maybe at the end. What do you think about that?
Okay.
We can stack them all up.
That's great.
On the QA after.
Cool. So all of you who sent questions, don't worry, we'll get to them at the end. All right, I'll share my screen now. Okay, and today we're going to talk about this ordering by aggregates in group by queries. And so for this demo, first I should say that in order to enable this feature, you need to have at least 2.21, the version of Prisma, and you need to also enable the flag, which I have enabled here. And I'm just using SQLite for this, and I've defined here two models. I've defined a user model, which just has some very basic information, email, city, name, and it also has a one-to-many relation to user rating. So the idea there is that every single user can have multiple ratings records associated with it. And the actual rating is stored as a decimal number, and that's here in the rating. And so there's a bunch of different queries that might become interesting in this context. And so let's take a look at the seed script that I've created here. I've just created a seed script to add some data. So I'm creating here a user, and I'm also creating different ratings for this user record. And then here another one. I'm also adding the city, and here this is the third record. And so I'm going to run this db seed command just to make sure that my database is freshly loaded and seeded with data. and it's been seeded. And so now let's take a look at some of the queries that might be interesting for this. And so I'm just going to close the terminal for a moment. So I'll open up the schema on one side so we can have that. And there we go. And so the first thing I'm doing is the font size large enough? I hope so. And so the first thing that we might be interested in is getting the count of different ratings that each user has, and then ordering the result set in a descending order based on the number of ratings that they each have. And this is done using this group by. I'm obviously grouping by the user ID because that is the item that I want to get the information sort of grouped by. And then I'm counting the number of ratings. So this is basically counting the number of related records. And then I'm using this order by here, and I'm using this underscore count. And the reason this starts with an underscore is so that it doesn't clash with any. This is an aggregated value that is calculated by the database. And in order to avoid potential collisions with your model names, we prefix that with a count. And so here I'm ordering it by the aggregate value of the count. And I'm telling it to order it in a descending order. And so I'm going to run this query now. I'll close up the terminal. And then in order to run this, I'm going to go npm run dev. And as we can see, we have for this user ID, we have a count of 4 ratings. And then for user ID 5, we have 3 ratings. And then for the user ID 6, we have 2. And as you can see, also they're ordered by the number of ratings. And this indeed should reflect what we have here in the seed script. So for this one user, we had 2 ratings, 3 ratings, and 4 ratings. And we can see that, in fact, if I were to go to the script and change the order to ascending, we should get the same result, but just in the inverse order. And indeed, we do. So that was one use case for that. But let's see what else might be interesting. Obviously, getting just a count is nice. But usually you want to sort of, when you're using a group by query, you want to do sort of different aggregations rather than just counting. And so I've created here another query, which very similarly, it does the grouping by the user ID because that's sort of the main entity that we want to group by and get aggregate information. And what I want to get here is I want to get the average rating per user from all of the different ratings. And then order that. So this was already possible, but now it's also possible to order by the actual aggregated value. And so assuming that you were running some like a movie review platform, something along the lines of, say, IMDb, and you wanted to get, say, the top 5 films based on their average rating, then this is the kind of query that you would want to run. And let's run this and see what comes out. And so here we get this average, and indeed it's ordered by in a descending order. So user ID 6 has the average rating of 9, and then that's followed by 7.5 and 4. So that was that. And then I thought it'd also be interesting to do one more group by, and this group by is actually on the user. And so here what I wanted to know is, if you remember in the schema we had for each user the city. And assuming that you say you wanted to get the count of users living in every city, this is what this query does. It actually does the grouping by city and gives you the users per city in descending order. So if I run that, oh, I don't think I've saved this. So I'll just run this again. And there we go. So if I look at the seed data again, we had Alice from Berlin, Bob from Ljubljana, this is the capital of Slovenia, and then Hannah from Berlin. And as we can see, indeed, we have two users who are in Berlin and one user in Ljubljana, and that's ordered in a descending order. So that was group by and the ability to now sort by an aggregate value. I think this is quite a nice feature that really sort of expands the kinds of use cases. It seems quite subtle and not a big deal, but actually this is quite a a major leap in terms of the kinds of queries that you can do. So that's it for this demo. I'll
Awesome.
stop sharing my screen.
That's great. Thank you for the demo, Daniel. That is very cool indeed in terms of a feature. The one thing that comes to mind for me always, and we had people asking questions about this last stream, was, does this work well for situations where you're needing to run this like constantly on lots of data, like in the context of maybe like a social media type application where you're getting likes and retweets and stuff like that. And that kind of use case is probably better served by architecting your database in a way where you're maybe storing those values periodically so that you don't have such a high load on your database, always trying to aggregate these values together. But in situations where you've got like a dashboard with a reasonable amount of data and you want to order things in a particular way, this is a really good way to get that data. And if you want to see the underlying queries, because this is ultimately not magic under the hood, this is constructing a SQL query for you to run against your database. You can always choose to log out the queries in your Prisma client instantiation so that you can see what's going on if you're concerned about which clauses are being used, how that might affect performance, and whatnot.
And Ryan, I think you touched on a really important point with this idea of like all of these aggregation queries being they can be quite expensive and load intensive. And this is where I think it might be useful to introduce this idea of like a materialized view.
Yep.
So a materialized view is essentially, you can do this in a lot of databases, especially relational ones. But the idea with a materialized view is that you actually you run a query and the result set acts as like a new table or a new view. And you can routinely sort of update the materialized view with new data. And the advantage of doing that is that it obviously doesn't have to do all of the calculation on every query. And this is very useful, especially in cases where if you're not updating the most up-to-date, if you're not displaying the most up-to-date number of, say, likes, it's not critical. Obviously, you want to get that as soon as possible, but it's not sort of this like really critical information. You want it to be eventually consistent, so to say.
That's very true. Yeah, it's interesting. That's the case you see on like Twitter, for example, where the numbers of likes and retweets for a given tweet at the time that you see them, those numbers being absolutely correct, that's not critical. That's like, it's nice. It'd be nice to have, sure, but it's not absolutely necessary that you see the real results right away. And I don't know, maybe they've fixed it since, but I remember a time when if you're scrolling past like a popular tweet that's getting all sorts of engagement at a given time, you would see those counts going up and then down and then up again and then down. You would see the numbers shifting around like that. And ultimately, I think what's happening there is like the data is being, I'm sure in Twitter's infrastructure, the data is being sharded across, different, different databases, not different databases, but like, it's being sharded. And so and then they've got load balancers in place, which requests are going to pick up data from an individual shard. So you're getting different results based on wherever your request lands, essentially at Twitter's API. Ultimately, when things slow down, that data is going to be stable, and you're going to see a true representation of those counts. But like if your application relies on like real up-to-date data at the time the user sees it, that's probably not a good way to do it. It's fine for social media, but not for critical applications. Cool. Okay, so where are we at? I think we are now going to move into some plugs and some calls to action and some Q&A. This is a relatively quick stream today. So why don't we do just that? One thing that we can talk about is the initiative that we've got going on called Tweets for Trees. Woohoo! I'm going to pull this open here so that folks can see it. And then, Daniel, actually, if you want to post the link in the chat, if you could, the Twitter.
Yeah, we'll do.
I'm just going to share my screen in one sec here so that we can see it. All right, so here we are. This is an initiative that we've got going on at Prisma, where in the month of April, if you send a tweet that tags Prisma, we will plant a tree for you. You can check out the blog post here as well. Perhaps, Daniel, if you haven't already, you can link this too. The idea is we want to help the environments. We think it's a great initiative to be more environmentally friendly. And we also like tweets that mention Prisma. So if you are wanting a tree planted in your name, in your honor, send a tweet that tags Prisma. We will then reply to you with a tree emoji telling you that message has been received, and we will plant a tree for you. So take a look for that. I think it's a super cool initiative that's going on here at Prisma, and something that hopefully will be good for the environment. All right. Do you want to talk about the next one, Daniel? Closed captions on videos.
Yes, so this is part of sort of like the inclusion sort of initiative that we have at Prisma, where we're really like trying to make content, educational and technical content available to the broadest sort of potential audience possible. And what we're offering is, so we're offering free captions for videos that are public. So if you have any talks on YouTube, lectures, live streams that have been recorded, and you would like to get captions for those, then we offer them for free. So if you're interested in that, you can just reach out at events@prisma.io. And this will hopefully make more videos online accessible to people who potentially can't hear or have some hearing problems or whatnot. So we're offering these free subtitles, and if you're interested, contact us at events@prisma.io. Now, on that note, probably it's worth mentioning that Prisma is also hiring. So we have a bunch of roles. Maybe you could drop the link. I think it's prisma.io/jobs. But we have a couple of openings. So we have an enterprise architect opening. We have a senior front-end engineer opening. We have a senior product manager, senior product marketing manager, a technical writer, and a VP of engineering. So if any of these roles sound interesting to you, feel free to go ahead and apply. And you can do that at the link that I believe Ryan has already dropped or will drop. Yep.
This is what the page looks like. So we've got these open positions here that Daniel just mentioned. Lots of cool stuff going on at Prisma, and come work with us. This, it's an awesome place to work. Everyone here is really great to work with, and I think if you are so inclined to be interested in a position here, you'd have a lot of fun. So check it out. Daniel, I'm realizing we skipped over something we meant to talk about, which was this page, Advanced Type Safety. I had that in the notes. What did you want to chat on for this one?
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that we have a new docs writer, and he's been working on this. So shout out to Rich, who just recently joined us. And the idea with these pages is to just cover some of the use cases where you might want to sort of tap into some of the TypeScript primitives that Prisma comes with, this is especially interesting if you want to sort of pass values around and then pass them into a Prisma query. So it's quite a specific topic if you're using TypeScript, but I highly suggest that you check out this page because there's a lot of situations where you can benefit from some nice features that TypeScript gives you just by sort of using some of these primitives, including the Prisma validator object. And this really goes into like how these generated types that are based on the Prisma schema work and how you can use them. So just wanted to give that a shout out.
Awesome. Yep. Great job here by Rich. This is looking really good. And for those who may still be on a super old version of Prisma, not a 1.0 version, but some old version at version 2, we did make a change where the Prisma namespace is now required to pull in some of these advanced types like user select, for example. You used to be able to import these directly from Prisma client. So instead of saying import Prisma from @Prisma client, you'd say import user select. These have now been grouped under this top level Prisma import. So just if something's not working in this regard, have a look for that. Maybe you're on an old version or something like that. But yeah, Daniel, that's a great note here. You can use these types to become even more refined in your type safety throughout your application, and it really shows I think the value of Prisma in a lot of ways. In that, it's not just like this type safe database access client that you get that knows about the shape of your database and stuff like that. We also generate a whole bunch of other types for you that are useful to provide even more type safety in your application. So great note on that, Daniel. Awesome stuff. So we have got another thing to show here. This is a course that we've talked about before, but we'll talk about it again. End-to-end React with Prisma 2. So if you're a React developer and you want to get Prisma into the mix, this course is excellent. This is on Udemy. I believe we have a discount code too, don't we, Daniel?
Yeah. So it should be available for free if you use the link, which I'll just drop now into the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, coupon code end-to-end APR 13, April 13. This is the code to use if you want to get this this course for 100% off. Check it out. It's by Dr. Steven. Is it Jensen or Jensen? I'm never sure.
Yeah, me neither. I think it's Jensen, but
in any
might have
case,
been living in Germany too long.
Yeah. In any case, Steven created this course. It's excellent. Check it out. I think you'll be happy with this if you haven't already checked it out. Budapest JS meetup. What's that all about, Daniel? I don't have the details on that one.
Yeah, so the Budapest JS meetup is a really great meetup. It's been going on for a very long time, and we've been collaborating with them, and we're actually going to be hosting this through the Prisma channel. So if you're interested in the meetup, it will take place in half an hour from now. And there's 2 talks, I believe, who that will be giving. And I think there's also a raffle for a JetBrains license. So yeah, check it out. I think that there's 2 topics, one quite relevant to Prisma users, and that is Next.js level querying. So that's going to be about Next.js. So if you're interested in also query builders and sort of broadening a bit your experience with database access libraries, that might be interesting. And then there's another talk about the one stack to rule them all. So yeah, check that out if you're interested.
Excellent. Very cool. Nico is not here today, of course, but we will talk about something that Nico did just recently, which is this article, What's New in Prisma Q1 21. And this is an overview of basically everything that has gone on in the first quarter of 2021. Lots of cool work has been shipped, and not only from the Prisma team, shipping both development on Prisma itself, and then also lots of content, but also the ecosystem has really been growing as well. So people might be familiar with other tools in the ecosystem that are built on top of Prisma. So things like Blitz, if you're a React developer and you want to have like kind of a full sort of framework feel, Blitz is like a framework that sits on top of Next.js, and it incorporates Prisma to give you this full kind of framework, if you will. Keystone.js is another one that uses Prisma under the hood, and there are others here as well. There's lots of cool stuff going on in the community to that use Prisma, and you might be interested in those things. If you're interested in a boilerplate to give yourself a good starting point for a SaaS application, Bedrock is one of those things by Max Stoiber. In any case, there has been lots going on in the Prisma world in the first quarter of 2021. And one of the big things, of course, is that Migrate is now generally available. This is kind of the big news, I think, for us, because it rounds out this feature set of things you need to be effective with an ORM. Things like a database access client, things like a migration tool, and also a way to view your data, which we have through Prisma Studio. In any case, if you're interested in a recap of what's been going on with Prisma, this is a great article that Nico put together. So check this one out. Anything to say there, Daniel, from your end?
No, nothing to add.
Okay, excellent. Well, what else do we have? We've got a couple other meetups to talk about. At least, I don't know, Daniel, should we talk about GraphQL Berlin? That was yesterday.
That was yesterday, and I think, let's see.
Do we have the next one scheduled?
I think we might. Let's see.
If you are interested in GraphQL and you are interested in attending an event put on by us, we do this one, GraphQL Berlin. We just had number 22 yesterday. It'll be on YouTube. Well, it already is on YouTube, the live recording. We're working on getting the individual talks kind of split out into individual videos. But check out the page here on Meetup. Just look for GraphQL Berlin and you'll find it. And if we don't have the next one scheduled just yet, I'm sure it will be coming up very soon. Let's see here. Prisma meetup. This is the one that just happened as well. We just had our Prisma meetup. And this one is available on YouTube as well. So we're doing lots of cool stuff in the meetup world. There are lots of events happening, and I'm sure you'll be interested in checking out some of this content. This one includes the Prisma meetup. It includes a talk from Spiros, who works here at Prisma. Also, Luke from IO Pool. IO Pool is a company that is working with Prisma under the hood, and they go into their story about how they've become more successful using Prisma. So that might be of interest. That's all that I see here on our list, Daniel. Did we miss anything? Is there anything more to talk about, or what do you think?
Nothing. I think we've covered it all so far.
Okay, cool. Well, in that case, I think what we do now is let's do some Q&A. How about it?
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's kind of orient ourselves here to the top of the questions.
Yeah.
All right, so Ahmed says, news about the Nexus plugin and commits the repo in a long time. What's going on with this? I don't have anything concrete, unfortunately, Ahmed, right now, but I think I have heard that there is movement coming for this. Again, the best place to check out updates would be the repo. Anything you want to say there, Daniel? I don't have anything more concrete than that.
No, as far as I know, the goal is to have something by this quarter, the second quarter of 2021. But the best place to sort of keep up to date would be either the Prisma roadmap, or there's also this task for this, which I can drop a link to.
Cool, thank you. Omar says, Prisma on AWS Lambda, the doc suggests setting connection limit to 1. Would that introduce bottlenecks of some kind? This gets into a topic which is a potentially complicated one that I know Daniel knows a lot about, and that is how the heck do you handle this connection limit issue with relational databases in a serverless setting? There are a lot of databases like Dynamo, for example, that lend themselves well to serverless settings because they're built to handle all sorts of connections. But if you're looking at using something like Postgres, it's not really meant to handle insane numbers of connections. So you got to do something to help with that. And Daniel has some recent content that goes into this topic. So I will let you speak to this, Daniel, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. So basically, the idea is that on AWS Lambda, every single Lambda instance that starts can only handle a single request. And this is quite different to the more traditional model of having a long process, a long running, say, node.js process that will maintain a certain number of connections to the database, and then it can accept, also many user requests coming into the API, and then it sort of queues them into and funnels them into the database, essentially. But because databases impose this limit, especially Postgres and MySQL, these connection-based databases, they actually have to allocate a certain amount of memory per connection. And so what tends to happen when you're using, say, AWS Lambda, and suddenly you have a spike in traffic, you have 200 instances spinning up to handle 200 requests that are coming in. If they all open a connection to Postgres, for example, then you're quickly going to exhaust the database connection limit. And so we generally recommend limiting the connection limit to 1, so that you have each Lambda instance only taking up 1 connection from the database. However, that doesn't fully solve the problem. And this is where something like connection pooling comes in. And so for Postgres, you have this tool called PG Bouncer that can help you basically scale up your connections. What it does is it keeps connections open to the database, and then it funnels the requests that come in. And so this actually sits between your application or your Lambda functions and your database. So that is one option. And I also believe that with AWS Aurora, there is also some kind of a connection pulling mechanism. However, as far as I can remember, this is not compatible with Prisma. I have to double check this, but this is sort of the rough idea. So the general recommendation is if you're using AWS Lambdas, definitely set that to 1, the connection limit, and then investigate the options in terms of connection pooling. Either use PG Bouncer or investigate whether the built-in connection pooling, which I believe doesn't work, but I will double check that in the docs. I think it's up to date in the docs. Besides that, we're going to have also more content on this coming soon. And so hopefully that will clarify any questions. And also one final note about PG Bouncer. If you are using PG Bouncer, you should use you should add the PG Bouncer flag to your connection string. And that is also documented in the Prisma docs.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel. Would it be worthwhile to share your video on deploying to Vercel, which talks about PG Bouncer?
Yeah, absolutely. I can.
Let's put that in here. Here's a YouTube link coming up, which is a video where Daniel talks about this topic, and in the context of Vercel and DigitalOcean, but PG Bouncer in the mix. Hopefully you can get a sense of how this all kind of goes together with these cloud providers. So thank you, Omar, for the question. This one is talking about relationships on both sides. I don't know that I really know the answer to this one. Is it necessary to put the relationship on both sides? Has some custom name, but I put it as one model. Let's create another relationship automatically. I'm a little unclear. Maybe there's a follow-up here. For example, the user model has many subscribe channels. I don't know. What do you think, Daniel? Are you able to kind of suss out what's being asked here?
Yeah, it's not 100% sure I fully understood that. I'm trying to read the first. I think it depends on the kind of relation that you're defining. If it's a many-to-many, I think with a many-to-many you can get away without having, on a many-to-many you obviously need the relation on both sides. But no, also I do think it's required on both sides. And the Prisma schema validator will also tell you this. So if you're using VS Code, it will actually tell you if your schema is invalid. But if you want a more useful answer, Krunal, I would suggest that you open a discussion or hit us up on the public Slack, and we'd be able to give you a more sort of elaborate answer.
Sounds good. Thank you, Daniel. Omar's got this question. When you have a field of type decimal, should its value be sent as a string from the front end? And how do you validate these? I think this is a bit of a tricky topic, because the way that your values end up getting to their destination at your backend kind of depends on what's going on along the way. So, for example, you mentioned joy here. I know that joy, and maybe you know this too, Daniel, because you've used happy and joy, I'm sure. When you set up certain validations with your joy validators, it will sometimes, if you set it up in certain ways, it will convert values for you. So if you send a string, but you say that that field should be like an int or a number or whatever, it's going to convert that value for you. So my take on this, without having too much more context, would be that what should you do from your front end? Well, if you know that your values should be set up in certain ways at your database, it's probably worthwhile to try to get your values to be set up in that way as they're sent all through. But if you are sending strings for whatever reason and you can convert at your backend, maybe that's an okay option. In any case, I think this is a question of where these values are being manipulated along the way. Ultimately, your database is going to want to store a value of a certain type, but there could be a lot of things happening to that value before it gets to your database. Any thoughts on that, Daniel?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're in your Prisma schema, if you define the type as decimal, then it obviously expects a decimal.js object, and you can instantiate a decimal.js object with a string. And so I'm not 100% sure what's the sort of the general way that this is done, whether that's using like the serialization format, but I would say the safer bet is probably to use a string, because that way you can be sure that it doesn't sort of like get any of the float inaccuracies along the way. So you can use string, and then you can set up sort of a validation class for that using Joy. But it should also be able to use to send it as a float. But then you run the risk of sort of the floating point inaccuracies. So it's best to test it quite thoroughly if you're sending it as a float, I would say.
Yep. Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Moving on. What is the suggested way to make a field validation in Prisma model, and will Prisma support field validation by model level? What to say about this? When you specify a type in your Prisma schema in your model, your database is going to expect that type, and you will get an error if that type does not arrive. But what beyond that? I don't know. I'm not sure if there's like a different way to validate that we might be thinking about. Maybe at author time instead of runtime is the suggestion here. I'm not too sure.
So Prisma Client actually does run validation. It's not quite as extensive as what a validation library would give you. With Joy, for example, you can really define very specific validation rules. But Prisma Client, before it actually sends the query, it'll actually run your input data through validation. And if it fails validation, it'll actually throw an error before even going to the database. So that's one thing. But that's obviously limited to just whatever types, can be validated based on, like, say, the Prisma schema, the types that are provided. So you can't do things like string length, for string length, or, for like regex running specific like email validation. There's different ways to do this, and basically there's a certain trade-off. So what you can do, and this is what we did also last year when I created the modern backend series, is we actually added just an extra layer of validation using Joy. And that does create some duplication, because essentially you're validating now things that theoretically could maybe be validated by Prisma. So that's one option. The other option is, I think may have seen some projects out there that are trying to combine, I think it was AJV validation library with Prisma. But yeah, this is sort of where we're standing at now. It's either you sort of like create another layer of validation, or you rely on the sort of very rudimentary validation that Prisma gives you built in.
Cool. All right. Next one. How would those group by features work with pagination? And there's a suggestion here. Paginate, count, group by. Pagination with group by. Well, what do we have for pagination at all?
Well, we have the support for cursor-based and for offset-based pagination. I can drop the link, but I'm not sure how this relates. Maybe Ryan. How does this relate to group by?
Maybe if you've got a lot of records and you want to get, your grouped records, but you want to also specify a limit to them, right? So you're paging through your aggregated grouped records, that sort of thing. That's what comes to mind for me. Perhaps I'm misunderstanding though.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear more. Nicholas, perhaps you could elaborate more with what you mean there. I'd love to really understand what's the use case.
All right, looking for a couple questions to close us out here. This one's a little bit broad. I don't know if we'll be able to give much of a useful answer here. If you're using Prisma, how would you handle the business logic? I mean, that's very dependent on your case, your application. I guess what we can say is that your business logic probably needs to happen a layer above where you'll interact with Prisma. Prisma is going to take your information that has been generated via your business logic and help you to put that information into your database. Ultimately, I think that is the play here. But if there's a more specific thing that you're wondering about here, please do feel free to ping in the chat. Okay. Here's one for you, Daniel, specifically. Elaborate on the database views approach, and maybe we can riff on that a little bit. Materialized views. A question that I often get about them is like, when should you use them? When does it make sense? When does it not make sense? So perhaps we could talk about that. When you should be looking towards a materialized view.
Yeah, so I mean, I know Postgres supports both normal views and materialized views. And the difference between them is whether the sort of the result set is actually persisted by Postgres. So with a view, every time you query a view, it'll actually run whatever query. And as I mentioned before, a view is really just a query that you define, and it sort of creates sort of a virtual table, so to say, from whatever query you've defined. So that's a view, and I think a view is useful if you happen to sort of run the same query a lot, and you don't want to define that query every time, so you want to sort of delegate that to the database. That's one thing. And then the materialized views, this is really where it can be thought of as some kind of like caching mechanism. You're basically like caching a result set. You would probably use that in a situation where the query is either really expensive or the query is mildly expensive, and you know that because it just takes time to run, and you don't really mind it if it's not the most up to date. So this is just how I think about database use, but I'm sure that there's different ways to think about this beyond what I've just shared.
Excellent. Yes, it is a topic I think that needs much consideration if you're thinking about using them, because there's like a lot of, I don't know, there's a lot of architectural design decisions that should be considered before you decide to use them or not. All right, here we go. Do we plan to support multi-tenant approaches? Keep data in different schemas? I don't know of any plans for us to have like kind of top level support for this. Maybe otherwise, Daniel. I know there's projects out there that help with this multi-tenant approaches in Prisma, but I can't remember off the top of my head if that was Prisma 1, perhaps, that I'm thinking about. Do you happen to remember?
So essentially, this would be a single Prisma schema that refers to multiple databases. I think this is already the realm of what the application data platform would eventually become. And so, Anton, I highly recommend that you check out the talk that Spiros gave. I can probably find a link to that. That's on our YouTube channel, where he discusses this whole idea of like, what's this application data platform? But at its very sort of the most basic description of it is it's essentially a system that allows you to query through multiple databases. And the idea with it is that you'll have a single interface to interact. But this is, of course, this is going to come in the future. As far as I'm aware, there is some thought being put into this idea of like supporting multiple database sources, and I would definitely check out. No, so what we do have planned is splitting the Prisma schema into multiple files, but as far as I'm aware, we don't really have anything in the roadmap to support a single schema and multiple databases.
Yeah, there's a project that I just linked to called Prisma Multi-Tenant that may be of interest for you to look at. I believe it relies on generators to do its work. So yeah, and I'm looking through the README to remind myself this might suit your use case, but check out the project that's linked there. It's like that GitHub link. Error name, I guess, is the GitHub account, and then Prisma Multi-Tenant is the project. So check that out. Hopefully it's useful. Comment here. We're waiting for MongoDB. We are too. Don't worry about that. We're definitely waiting, and it'll be here at some date in the future soon. That's what we can say about that. Any plan to provide a Hasura-like migration defining in a graphical user interface? Product-wise, maybe this will be something that you can look forward to in the future with the application data platform plans, the commercial offerings, etc. I don't know of anything concretely, though. I don't know, Daniel, do you?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay. I know that it's something. It's an idea that's been tossed around as a useful feature. So stay tuned for that. Perhaps we'll see it. What else do we have? I think we're close to the bottom of the questions, Daniel. I don't know. Do you see any there that we should pop in that we haven't answered?
Oh, okay. I see that Nicholas wrote back. This was more of an open question. He didn't have a use case in mind. So, okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I can't think of a use case either. But if you do come up with something, I'd love to hear it.
There's one I just saw here. What's the best Node.js framework for use with Prisma? I mean, really, it's any framework. Anywhere that you can use a Node module, you can just pull in Prisma and use it. Maybe what we could talk about is what do we use personally? Daniel, I know you're a fan of Happy.js. You've had success with that with Prisma. Is that still your go-to?
Yeah, although recently I have been spending a lot more time with Fastify that I'm really excited about. I think it's taking also a very similar approach to Happy in many ways, but it's actively developed. And besides that, my general sort of, when I get asked this question, my general thought is, the best tool is the one that you're familiar with. So it's really like your level of experience with a framework plays a pretty big role. I mean, there's obviously differences, and they can be discussed, but that's generally sort of what I think.
Yep. I think as a general rule, if you can find something that, like if you kind of are looking for options, if you can find something that's got really good TypeScript support, that's going to bode very well when you're using Prisma, because Prisma obviously has a very excellent TypeScript support. So if you get good TypeScript support elsewhere, it's going to be an awesome time for you. All right. That's all I see that we should pop in for talking about. So I think we're there. We went longer than I thought we would today, so that's excellent. Thank you, everyone, for all of the questions. Great questions today. Stay tuned for more coming out at the 2.22 release. So we'll see everyone back on the live stream, I believe, in 2 weeks. Or has it been? I think there's a date. There's a new date for 2.22, which will be...
Yeah, it'll actually be in 3 weeks.
3 weeks. Yeah, so we're doing a little bit of a longer time between. It'll be 3 weeks this time, May 4th, on Star Wars Day. Welcome back, everybody, here to the live stream, and we will maybe we'll do like a Star Wars theme thing that day. What do you think, Daniel?
Why not?
Why not? Yeah, there's probably a lot of Star Wars fans out there. In any case, everyone take care. Thank you so much for joining today, and we'll catch you later.
All right.